Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is technically the third episode because, well, reasons. And the other videos will be coming out in a few months, few weeks, I don't know. So, instead of the Coombridge and Toltec, we're going to Leadville. Sorry, I'm really sorry, but enjoy the video. And there was a firework in the background, so let's get out of here. And also, I want to introduce the Leadville Railroad in my own special way. Let me introduce you to the narrator guy. I'll put the name in the thing.
Our next stop is in central Colorado, at the old mining town of Leadville. Our next stop is in central Colorado, at the old mining town of Leadville. The Leadville, Colorado and Southern takes passengers on a 22-mile round trip along a portion of the old Denver, South Park and Pacific, which later became a part of the Colorado and Southern. Steam locomotive number 641 is on display as a reminder of the CNS days. The train departs Leadville caboose first, with the locomotive pulling on the return trip.
Across the flow that sequence will warn at every single road crossing, and this is to alert cars and pedestrians. In fact, we are a moving train when you have it right away. Now coming up here on the downhill side of the train, ladies and gentlemen, we are first up going to pass by the old Colorado and Southern freight depot. The old freight depot was used in the 1880s and 1890s to keep track of and service the freight trains that were headed down towards Denver back in the day. Now in the mid 20th century, right around 1950, that building was actually converted to a lumber mill. And she operated as a lumber mill all the way up until about 2015, I want to say, when she was converted to a place. Quick interruption.
After leaving Leadville, our train enters a forest of aspen and pine. We're on one of the first trips of the season, thus there are a few empty seats on the train.
Fun to see them hanging out. Now, folks, Leadville was also it played a large role in the railroading industry in Colorado. The narrow gauge railroad was recently invented in the 1850s, and the new narrow gauge railroads were expanding their railroading empires to tap into the riches of the Rockies. Leadville played a large role in that, as we had over 7 different railroad companies coming to Leadville back
Ever
in the day.
since it was built, this railroad has been called the High Line, a name that is easy to see as we cling to a narrow shelf high above the valley below.
The narrative of this rail line and how it came to be a little bit throughout our entire journey today. Now, right now, folks, we are traveling across one of the more level sections on today's train ride. Later in our journey, we will start to climb a grade of about 2.5%, and our average speed will be approximately 10 to 12 miles an hour. You might think that is sort of a slow speed for a train to travel at, but we do think the perfect speed in photo taking and very possible wildlife viewing opportunities you will have from today's train. And as we do around the next curve here, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to enter into the power line tangent. Here on the power line tangent, you guys will get a great example of the two long, a short and a long that we blow at every single road crossing.
Tickets. Wait, not yet.
Now in this area, folks, we crossed a stretch of tracks that is known as the Power Line Tangent. The Power Line Tangent is the longest straight stretch of track along our entire train ride today. And here across the tangent, you all may notice many large holes that are dug into the forest floor. These holes that you might see throughout our train ride today are known as prospect holes. Prospect holes back in the day were a method that miners would utilize to essentially survey the land. They would dig large holes in the ground to see if they could find any precious metals. If they found such a thing, they would take a sample of that dirt to the Attang office in Leadville. And the actor would determine the worth of that land. If so desired, the miner could purchase that land from the federal government as a mining claim. However, if not, he would typically leave the holes as they were, and they would move on. Now, as the aforementioned, after silver was discovered in Leadville, folks, we became a very large boom town. Back in its heyday in 1879, Leadville, Colorado was home to 19 hotels, 41 lodging houses, 38 restaurants, 82 saloons, 6 livery houses and stables, 12 blacksmith shops, 7 smelters and production rooms, 2 assaying offices, 28 churches, and of course the housing to accommodate the 45,000 residents that called the city of Leadville home. Back in those times, ladies and gentlemen, Leadville, Colorado was even considered to become the state capital. Leadville is actually older than the state of Colorado itself. We were founded in 1875, and Colorado would be ratified into the United States back in 1876. To become a state, we had to select one of our cities to utilize as our state capital. And so they took the 5 largest cities in the Colorado Territory, put them on a list, and took a vote. These cities included Denver, Central City, Golden, Temple Creek, and of course, the city of Leadville. Now, as we all know, Denver would win the title for state capital, as they do serve as the state capital here in Leadville today. However, Leadville missed out on being the state capital by just 2 votes. Now, down there in Denver, folks, they do think they're pretty cool, and they like to refer to themselves as the Mile High City. And up here in Leadville, we think that's just a little bit lame, and we refer to those Denver residents as lowlanders. We do like to gloat just a little bit, and we refer to ourselves as the 2 Mile High City, as Leadville's official elevation is 10,152 feet above sea level at our city center, at the east side of town getting as high as 10,600 feet above sea level. Leadville, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact the highest incorporated city in all of North America. Here in Leadville, we do boast the nation's highest post office, golf course, North America's highest airport, and right now you are riding North America's highest standard gauge adhesion railroad. Now on the downhill side of the train, ladies and gentlemen, about 20 feet off the side of the train tracks today, you will notice a small wire that kind of runs up in the trees and along the forest floor. Not all the wire that you see there on the downhill side is actually the original telegraph wire used for communication between Leadville and Climax Mine via Morse code. Now I will tell you folks that there are a remaining 10 telegraph poles on the downhill side today. And it's kind of a fun little scavenger hunt to see if we can find all 10 of our remaining telegraph poles. They look a little bit like an old power line.
Is this the
About half of these
outside?
poles are still standing and the other half have been knocked down or are leaning over pretty significantly. So good luck in finding all 10. Now across the next half mile or so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start seeing a lot of aspen trees. The aspen tree is very easily identifiable. It's got white bark and black circular features on the tree trunks. These black circular features do look a little bit like eyeballs on the tree staring back at you. The black features are known as poles. They're created when an aspen tree will drop off all the way to dead or its lower branches, and they do so naturally as a defense against wildfires. The aspen tree is kind of one of Colorado's more iconic tree species, ladies and gentlemen. They are a high elevation tree, only thriving really above 7,000 feet above sea level, all the way up to about 12,000 feet. And these trees are actually a very unique organism, ladies and gentlemen. That is because these trees actually propagate by their root system. This means that a single aspen grove is entirely connected via its root system. That makes a single aspen grove a single living thing. Aspen groves can be some of the largest living organisms on the planet, and the largest aspen grove sits in Utah, taking up over 100 acres of land. Aspen groves can also be referred to as aspen clones. And that being the case, the Air Force actually does quite a bit of their high altitude mountain training in this area. But it needs to have 3 different F-16s flying. F-16s flying across this area.
Holy crap.
But anyway, back to the aspen trees here. We are actually coming into one of the largest aspen groves along our entire train ride today. This grove is entirely connected on both sides of the track here. And it is a single living organism. As I was saying, the aspen trees propagate across the root system by cloning themselves. Each and every aspen grove or aspen clone will have its own unique DNA. This DNA decides things for the trees, like when they grow their leaves in the spring, what shade of green they'll be in the summer, and whether or not they turn orange or yellow in the fall. The fall months for the aspen tree are perhaps the most iconic time of year, as they do turn into a very rich golden yellow up here. And being at these high elevations, we get a little bit of an earlier fall compared to most places. The peak of our fall color is usually that 3rd week of September. 2 more neat facts about the aspen tree, ladies and gentlemen. They produce a chemical in their bark that is known as salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is actually the primary ingredient in painkillers such as aspirin. Now what's cool about this is that biologists here in Colorado have actually observed cow elk eating the bark of an aspen tree just before giving birth to their newborn elk calves. Finally, these beautiful trees do produce a very fine white powder on their bark, and this white powder works as an effective sunscreen for human beings. It sits right around SPF 15. Avalanches are a very serious part of backcountry travel in the winter season. It does seem that we have several avalanche fatalities every single winter up here. And they are definitely something that we have to be cognizant of here in the Leadville area. Now they are obviously a result of the large snow loads that we do receive up here during the winter season. Being at these high elevations up here in Leadville, Colorado, winter is just a fact of life for us. In fact, we do like to tell our guests that we have about 9 months of winter and about 3 months of bad skiing. On average, the Leadville area receives approximately 250 inches of snow every single winter. And being at these high elevations, we truly do have about 9 months of winter up here. Our first snowfalls will usually take place in the month of October. Now, they'll actually happen earlier than that, but snow that sticks to the ground is in October. We will then see snow every single month after that, usually up until late May and occasionally into early June. Being up at these high altitudes, we actually have the chance of seeing snowfall 365 days out of the year. My best example of this would be about 5 years ago now. We came up the train tracks on the summer solstice, which was just a few days ago now. But on the first day of summer, we had a major snowstorm that dropped over 8 foot of snow on the train tracks up here. And so on the first day of summer, we came up the train tracks in a winter wonderland. A little bit ironic, but that's just kind of how we roll here in Leadville. I've even seen the snow up here in the month of July. Just another That's due to timberline. And I'll tell you a little bit more about timberline a little bit later in today's train ride when we get a better example of it. But right now we are in the subalpine forest, which is the aspen trees, lots of little pine trees, and mostly subalpine fir, angling, or blue spruce trees. Now the winters obviously do play a large role in the lives of the wildlife that calls Colorado home. And many of Colorado's beautiful wildlife species do have many different adaptations to help them deal with the harsh winter conditions. Now speaking of wildlife, a lot of folks do ask me what different kinds of animals we are able to see here on this mountainside. And we actually do get the chance to see many of Colorado's beautiful big and small creatures. During the summertime, there are a lot of large game animals. Almost every single train ride we have the chance of seeing mule deer. Now for those of you who are from eastern Colorado, you are not likely used to seeing mule deer. They are slightly larger than your white-tailed deer, and they are so named because they have extremely large ears. We do see mule deer pretty much every single train ride, so be sure to keep a sharp eye out, especially in the forests on the uphill side of the train, as we do have several resident mule deer that call this area home all summer long. Now we do see some other large game animals, ladies and gentlemen. We have the chance of seeing black bears, elk, and moose. We see some smaller game animals such as pikas, marmots, squirrels, ground squirrels, pine martens, porcupines, weasels, and the occasional fox or coyote. And a few years back now, we actually did have a very rare sighting of a mountain lion right here from the train tracks. If you get the chance to see a lion in your lifetime, you should consider yourself very fortunate. These animals are extremely elusive, very good at hiding, and they have large territories of up to 300 square miles. Colorado is thought to have a very large mountain lion population, anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 of these big cats in the state. Because of that, they do say if you spend a lot of your time hiking in Colorado's backcountry, while you will not see the mountain lion has likely seen you. They are very curious animals and do like to know who is passing through their territory at any given time. Now, as I said, folks, we also have the chance of seeing black bears from the train. Typically, the best time of year to see a black bear is usually the month of August. We get a lot of wild raspberries that grow along the train tracks, and it does draw the bears to the area. Now, a lot of folks do seem to think that we have grizzly bears in Colorado, but we actually do not. Grizzly bears used to be here, but they were hunted to extinction back in the 20th century. The last official grizzly sighting in Colorado took place in 1975. I think a lot of people get confused because of the color of our black bears. Being called a black bear is a little bit deceiving, as these animals actually come in many different colors. There are blonde black bears in Colorado, brown black bears, and due to the genetics in Colorado, about 85% of our black bears are actually a cinnamon reddish colored base. Now from here, folks, when you look down there on the mountain, or excuse me, on the valley floor beneath us, you will see a wetland ecosystem known as a riparian area. That ecosystem down there is the perfect habitat for the largest animal that we get to see from the train, which would be the moose. Now, I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I did see a moose down there just about 4 days ago now, so be sure to keep a sharp eye out, as there are a couple of resident moose hanging out in the area here today. It was actually back in 2020 that we had our first ever moose sighting. Now, moose populations in Colorado have been growing rapidly, and since then we've seen a few moose, typically a couple of moose a month up here on the letterville river. Here in Colorado, we do have the smallest subspecies of moose, which is known as the Shiras moose. Do not let that fool you. Remember, these animals still stand about 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and they can weigh about 1,100 pounds on the top end of the scale. A little known fact about the moose, ladies and gentlemen, they are fantastic swimmers. Moose are capable of diving 25 feet, and they do so regularly to eat the greens that grow on lake bottoms here in Colorado. Now, the moose is a rather unusual looking creature, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit awkward. Because of this, it has worked itself into different nicknames here in the state of Colorado. The moose has been referred to as the pine camel. They are known as the bucket nose. And my favorite nickname for the moose would be the swamp donkey. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my personal favorite creature to see here from the train ride, well, that title would have to go to the Rocky Mountain elk. I simply think the elk are one of the most majestic creatures that Colorado has to offer. Usually the best time of year to see an elk from the train ride is in the spring or in the fall. We don't really see a lot of elk over the core of the summertime. Now, the reason for that is due to the migrational patterns of these animals. You see, elk are actually some of the most migratory well known as the Nomad. I first found Nomad, like I said, about 7 years ago now on a riverbed right around 7,000 feet above sea level. We had a nice little evening photo shoot and we went our separate ways. I never really thought I would see that bull again, as he was the largest bull elk I had ever seen, and those large bulls are typically very elusive. But as fate would have it, about a week later, I was in an entirely separate mountain range, some 20 miles from where I was the week before. I spotted a large bull way up high on the side of the mountain, and I started hiking to that animal. When I made it to him, to my surprise, it was the very same bull that I had seen the day before. He had moved some 20 miles that week. Now, about a year later, I would find the Nomad yet again on the very same riverbed, right around 7,000 feet above sea level. I was thrilled to see the old bull at the peak of his life. He was very large that particular year. Now, it was too dark for photos that evening, and that bull was cruising through the area very quickly. Well, based upon the direction he was heading, and based upon what he did the year prior, I decided I was going to try that other mountain range in the morning. I drove out there and I started hiking into the peaks at about 3:30 that next morning. And to my surprise, just before the sun came up, the Nomad would greet me there the very next day. After having followed this bull for the past 7 years now, I can tell you that he makes this 23-mile migration every single year in just one night. On that journey, he climbs close to 5,000 feet in elevation gain. And typically this journey takes him about 8 hours or so. Now, over those past 7 years, I have taken the time to piece together the entire migration route, and I can faithfully tell you that I can follow him across his entire journey now. The Nomad is one of the largest bull elk that I have ever seen, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, I was fortunate enough to score his shed antlers in 2021 and in 2022. In 2021, Nomad scored 409 inches on Boone and Crockett, which for those of you that do not know is an extremely large bull elk, and that was not even his biggest year. Now at this point in time, the Nomad is a very old bull. He's about 14 years old this year. He's definitely
like
the
around
very
here
end of his
when we
life.
saw it.
When I found him, he was at the peak of his life at about 7 years old. And folks, I was fortunate enough to see the Nomad just on Sunday morning, about 2 days ago now. I caught him at the very top of his migration, and I can tell you that he was at the bottom of his migration the evening before, because I had a friend who saw him that evening. It's been a blessing to follow that bull over the past 7 years now. If any of you would like to see some photos of the Nomad, please ask me about that. I'd be happy to share some with you. I can do so on the way back on the mountain today. Now, speaking of antlers, ladies and gentlemen, antlers are one of the more unique processes that take place in our wild world. A lot of people do confuse antlers and horns, but they are not the same thing. You see, horns are permanent on an animal's head. Animals like bison, bighorn sheep, mountain goats, and then pronghorn antelope all grow horns. And they will only ever get one set of horns for their entire life. Furthermore, horns are made out of the same material as your fingernails, which is known as keratin. Antlers are a little bit different because they're made out of pure solid bone. And for another thing, these animals actually lose their antlers and grow a new set every single year. We ventured into the sharpest curve along our entire train ride today. This curve is known as the bird's eye curve. Bird's eye curve makes for an excellent photo-taking opportunity. The curve is so sharp here that the engine and the canoes will be able to see one another, and you will get a great shot of Treasure Belt Mountain towering above us here at Bird's Eye Gulch. For those of you who are looking for our 10 different telegraph poles, there's a guinea for you here in the middle of the gulch. As we make our way around to the middle of the bird here, there is a beautiful small mountain stream that runs through Bird's Eye Gulch here. And it's kind of fun here, folks, to wave to the passengers on the opposite ends of the train. Be sure to wave to those folks out there as they wave back here too.
It's okay.
Organized into a single railroad company.
And
And
it's
this all looked great on paper, ladies and gentlemen, but unfortunately those two railroads could not overcome their agreement or their differences. There were many instances of sabotage and foul play between the two railroad companies, and that ultimately led to many legal battles between these two railroading rivals. 6th, 1884. They worked very hard, and by August of 1883, they had finished the railroad from Denver to Dillon, Colorado, which is about 40 miles away from Leadville. Now this meant that they had a 6-month period to build a 40-mile stretch of track. I don't know if you folks have ever built railroad track by hand before, but having done a lot of work on our tractor team, I can tell you that it is very hard work. To make matters even worse, during those last 6 months of the year, they were trying to finish the rail line in the dead of winter. They had to deal with a recorded 12 feet of snow on the ground that year, and temperatures that dropped to 35 degrees below zero. Unfortunately, about 10% of the men who worked on this rail line would die up there in the harsh conditions as they tried to meet their deadline of February 6, 1884. Now, what do you all think? Do you think the Denver South Parks and Pacific's hard work would pay off and they would beat that deadline before it came up? Well, I'll let you all know here in just a few minutes. But first, I'm going to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger, ladies and gentlemen, both figuratively and rather literally. As we do make our way around the S-curve here, we're going to enter into a stretch of track that we like to call the edge of the world. If you are afraid of heights, I might recommend looking to the uphill side of the train at this time, as we will be over.
Yeah, no thanks. I like death.
And just 5 feet from the edge. Don't worry though, ladies and gentlemen, it's been about 5 years now since we've lost any train cars on cliffs up here.
I think that's a joke, right?
Now, for those who are on the uphill side, there are some cool things to see. I find it very cool to see the rock walls that tower over the train in this area. And you also might notice some funny discoloration on the rock faces. This discoloration can be orange, lime green, yellow, and black. This discoloration is actually a life form that is known as lichen. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between fungus and algae that does only grow on rock faces. To help people remember these facts about the lichen, I do enjoy telling a very lame joke. I typically tell people that the fungus and the algae got to like each other. However, last I heard, the relationship was unfortunately on the rocks. A real beast slapper for you folks there. Now, for those that do not mind the hype, we do get an excellent panorama view of the Arkansas River Valley. Yes, that is the Arkansas River you see on the valley floor beneath us, and you are looking at the headwaters of the Arkansas. The Arkansas River is actually the 6th longest river in the lower 48 states, and right now you are within the first 5 miles of the headwaters here. Now this rail line up here, ladies and gentlemen, is known as the High Line to Leadville route. It's pretty obvious as to why they call it the High Line, but a lot of people do ask me why it was built way up here on the mountainside, as opposed to that nice flat valley floor. For that answer, I will direct your attention to the valley floor itself. If you're on the downhill side, look out there towards the left. You will see a sharp right curve in the highway. Just to the left of that sharp right curve, there is a diagonal line going across the valley. There's kind of an old two-track line. That is the old railroad grade, or the Rio Grande Railroad. The Rio Grande Railroad then kind of took a right turn cutting into the forest on the other side of the valley. You can kind of see where they come through the trees there. With the Rio Grande having their railroad grade down there on the valley floor, after legal battles between the Rio Grande and the South Park, the Supreme Court ruled that those two railroads could not have a rail line within 700 yards of one another, as they were too violent with each other. The Rio Grande already expanded northward into this valley, and so the South Park was forced to build way up here on this mountainside, further increasing their difficulties. Now, do you all remember where we left the South Park off at? We left them up here in the dead of winter, trying to meet their deadline of February 6, 1884. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on February 5th, 1884...
Wait, I think this is one of the bridges that they filled in.
...successfully complete their rail line into Leadville, just one day before the before the deadline was due. A bit of good fortune was on their side, as they had successfully completed the shortest route from Denver to Leadville, two of the largest cities in the West. This 150-plus-mile excursion by rail would ship both passenger and freight trains upon it, and that journey by rail back in the day would take about 12 hours. Now, upon its completion, the president of this rail line, Governor John Evans, decided he was going to sell the rail line, and he did so to that man I referenced earlier, Jay Gould. Now, Jay Gould was actually the president of the Union Pacific Railway, and so this rail line would then fall under the jurisdiction of the Union Pacific Railway Company. It was operated as a branch line of the Union Pacific, and it was known as the South Park Division of the UP. It operated under that namesake for the next 16 years or so, from 1884 all the way up until 1898. Now in 1898, due to some mismanagement on Union Pacific's part, ladies and gentlemen, they actually drove the South Park division to bankruptcy. When they did, Union Pacific was forced to sell this rail line to the Colorado and Southern, and they did so in 1898. CNS was very successful in their operations on this rail line, ladies and gentlemen. They controlled the rail line for the majority of its lifetime. They shipped both passenger and freight trains on this rail line from when they bought the line in 1898 all the way up until 1937. Now in 1937, ladies and gentlemen, due to a lack of demand for passenger traffic, the last ever passenger train would leave the city of Leadville headed towards Denver on October 19, 1937. Now after that took place, ladies and gentlemen, the Colorado and Southern made the very unfortunate decision to abandon the entire railroad from Denver to the top of Fremont Pass. That meant that they tore up 137 miles of railroad track. Now that left us with the 14 miles of the Highline route that we are traveling on here today. And so the question is, why did the Colorado and Southern leave a 14-mile stretch of mountain railway just north of the city of Leadville? Well, that was due to a new mine that had opened up just north of the city of Leadville itself. This mine was known as Climax Mine. I'll be going into the depths and history of the mine here in just a few minutes. But for now, understand that CNS has Leadville to service the line with freight trains. We started doing
One second.
On here in just a few minutes, ladies and gentlemen. A couple of quick highlights to point out before then. Today, it was up here to service the steam engines with water, and they used it on every single trip. Now, the water tower was a gravity-fed water tower, ladies and gentlemen.
Water.
And that means that they
And
used to
now
have a
coming up
reservoir up here in the
here
north.
is
The dam for
the
reservoir
water
is about
tower
400 yards up
used
Gulf
to have
Plus
some.
from the train tracks. And they
There's
had
also a
piping
reason why
system to
there's no
feed the water
track
tower itself. It was all
water tower.
gravity-fed.
And then later
Now, as
the
we around
train
the
comes
corner
back
here, ladies
down
and
here
gentlemen, you will
for
notice that the water tower does not
train.
line the train tracks whatsoever, and it needed to fill the steam engines with water. That is actually due to a major accident that occurred up here on June 23rd, 1980, 55 years ago yesterday. The dam for the reservoir actually gave way and it caused a flash flood to rip down the gulch. It washed out the entire section of train tracks right in the middle of the
last
gulch, where
two.
the open car in the middle of the train is currently traveling on. This washout was over 70 feet deep, and it was over 200 feet across. An engineer for the Burlington Northern Railroad was on his way into Leadville when he noticed that the train tracks were missing from this area. He and his firemen hit the emergency brake on the train, and they both choked off.
obviously.
Now they sustained only minor cuts and bruises, but that locomotive was going too quickly to stop. It would crash right into the bottom of the washout. This would cost the Burlington Northern Railroad $55,000 just to get a crane up here to hoist the engine out of the washout. After they did so, they brought it back down to the roundhouse, and after draining it of its fluids, they were going to store that locomotive on the spur track just west of the roundhouse, known as the North Y. Now, speaking from experience, ladies and gentlemen, the North Y has a very steep downhill grade into the end of it. Ask me how I know. They went to shove that locomotive into the end of the Y that day, but they failed to properly couple to that engine. They shoved it into the Y, and when they stopped, the engine they were shoving kept on going, and they derailed it entirely for the second time that week. Can't imagine they were too happy with those guys.
Yeah, they were
Ultimately,
probably
shoved
fired.
the locomotive off to Lincoln, Nebraska, and it was actually repaired and restored to rail service. If any of you would like to see some photos of that locomotive crash or the derailment at the roundhouse, you can actually have some photos in the concession car. They are on the wall of the uphill side, just about halfway down through the park. Pretty neat to see that engine crash, so be sure to check those out.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, here on the downhill side, you are looking at the largest set of aspen trees that we have along our entire train ride. You might remember how I was talking about how aspen groves are different from each other. They have their own DNA and such. There are actually 2 aspen groves along this right here. You can't really see in the summertime because they are so similar. But in the fall, one of the aspen groves turns bright orange, which is kind of uncommon for aspen trees, and the other one turns into the classic golden yellow. is because we have reached our destination for the day here. Milepost 142 is where we are currently sitting, and that is 142 miles from our depot down in Denver. Or at least the old depot down in Denver, back in the South Park days. Now, if you were to continue onward up the track from here, there are 5 miles of track above us.
Later that day. Loud noise. Good afternoon. Yo, Marika. Howdy, howdy. Say hello to YouTube. Yo, say hello, little boy. Yo, you're on YouTube. Hello to YouTube. Yo, hi, hello, hello, hello. $300. Goodbye. See you tomorrow. Hopefully you like your experience in there. Thank you. That was awesome.